So obviously there's a lot of turmoil in the markets. Of course, I think S&P is down, I believe 13% month over month. There's a lot of conversation around tariffs. Is there a recession coming? Is there not? And I think more than anything, people, consumers, of course, and even CMOs, marketers, business owners, they're not just struggling with the impacts of what the tariffs could mean for their brands, but also just the uncertainty, right?
Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah.
on one hand, it's how do you respond to these major fluctuations in the market? How do you combat tariffs? But on the other side, it's just viewpoint, an approach as to just how do you deal with uncertainty, because we're hearing tariffs are going to come, they're not going to come anymore, and we're hearing certain products are going to be excluded. So I just wanted to open up there. Do you have any preliminary thoughts on the matter?
Yeah. Yeah. I think, the conversation I've seen happening, across business owners and leaders and marketers, I think is the right conversation. There's a pretty big focus on making sure we have really tight feedback loops on our audiences, on our customers. So making sure we understand how this uncertainty and this volatility is really impacting them. Um, Impacting the way they make purchasing decisions and life decisions, right? So that means like social listening and customer surveys. That's how you sort of adapt. That's how you're ready to change your messaging. You're really like sort of watching current events, but not just the current events. It's also understanding how your audiences and how your customers are also experiencing those current events. We were talking earlier, Monish, there are like some other things we can focus on um, that might not seem as obvious, that are worth potentially exploring or sharing with each other.
One
Mhm.
is, of course, we mentioned humor, Julie, internally prior to this. Could we lean into humor in terms of, from a messaging standpoint,
Mhm.
get through,
Yeah.
focus to consumers? I think you had the idea of like, what if we call out the actual percentage of the tariff and just include that in the headline? Um,
Yeah, or just being silly. I mean, I feel like when things are so uncertain, you know, we can respond we can respond with fear, we can respond with panic, um, but also when things are so over the top, it's an opportunity to find the humor in it, to lean into that humor and to make that, if it's right for your brand, to make that a moment for you and your customers, and to sort of have a smile together, have a laugh together. It seems counterintuitive, but it might be a worthwhile thing to experiment with for some brands.
and I liked what you said earlier around sentiment analysis. Like
Hmm.
we use tools like, I think Brand Watch is one that comes to mind, where we're actually able to determine what the current state of mind is of our
Hmm.
consumers, like what are their values, and how are they going to respond to shifts, whether that's a shift in messaging, whether if it's a shift in pricing, and those sorts of analytics could, I think, help get us closer to the right answer before crunch time.
Yeah. I really liked what you said about thinking about your offering and your packages and trying to innovate around that. There's potentially an opportunity there for businesses to, you know, if their inventory is impacted, think about, well, what can I offer? What pivots can I make in my offering, maybe in the short term or as an experiment for the long term, that is going to be more manageable in this new climate. Um, I love that as a silver lining. I love, anytime you have a stressful moment and there's a silver lining around innovation, I think that's really exciting. You're really turning a challenge into an opportunity there. Oh, you touched on this a little bit, like sort of messaging around pricing. So, like, if you're going to commit and communicate something like, hey, our pricing is frozen until, June 1st. So come purchase now or by June 1st. You're creating that urgency as well, which is a great tactic. Um, just to make sure you're not losing any momentum on sales, maybe while you figure out a longer term sourcing plan. And then there's sort of like lighter weight versions of that. That's similar type messaging around, made in the USA or locally made or American sourced or like community first values. It has to be right for the brand, but I think this is a moment to try leading into that. Uh, a moment like no other to talk about your USA sourced materials and things like that. I do think that will get a bit more, that will resonate more now potentially than previously. And then also messaging around like education. So education around sourcing. I don't. It might not matter to some audiences, but for some people who, depending on the product or the category, having that education and that be part of the touch point with the brand might work really well.
Yeah, for sure. Focusing on what I'm hearing there is focusing on agility, potentially dynamic
Mhm.
creative,
Yep.
where it makes sense, and ensuring your inventory is synced, right? Going back to the point about maybe you need to find a different vendor. We've been talking about what the impacts could be on tariffs on businesses, on consumers. But for the CMOs out there, this is an opportunity to really exercise agility and
Mhm.
really try to understand that, not only are you potentially going to be losing out on revenue, you're if nothing changes, you're going to keep burning cash. So this is precisely the moment when you do the work, the predictive analytics work we were discussing. Maybe you want to increase your price 10, 15, 20%. What is actually going to be the impact longer term if you do that? Also the current marketing mix, right? What channels are you active on? This is a time to test incrementality, leveraging holdout markets,
Mhm.
really trying to understand, using causal impact studies, trying to understand if you're running, CTV, Meta, SEM, programmatic native audio, are all those channels really driving incrementality? If not, this is the time to double down and reinvest into your highest converting segments, not
Yeah.
just across campaigns and audiences, but across platforms as well.
Yeah, I think that's a great idea as a focus on incrementality. I think that, no business can afford to stop marketing. So that's
Yeah,
not an option on the table. And, you know, it might also, flip side of the coin, might also make sense to just really lean into awareness and brand building for the short term. And then when, if like, let's say you have a SWAT team figuring out supply chain right now, but they need time to figure this out,
yeah,
pulling that money into brand building, into brand equity and awareness, really just focusing there for when you're ready to get back into the sort of like lower funnel, middle funnel messaging, um, and calls to action. That might be the best way to spend your money in the short term, um, especially if you're not ready to really do an incrementality study right now. But you talked about leadership. I think, this is a tough time for leaders, and if you run a small company, if you have a marketing team, if you're the CMO at a larger company, right? I think it's just so important to stay, like we said at the top, stay close to your customers so that you can understand their mindset, be really agile and adaptive, um, be really strong and transparent for your team as always, right? So the best leaders do, and being really resilient. I think like this can feel like a once in a lifetime challenge. I had a good stat, someone from my team shared with us that the truth is this is sort of like an acceleration of a trend, because before this wave of tariffs, there was a 460% increase in trade regulations and restrictions just in the past 5 years. So that's not to diminish the impact that this moment is having on our businesses and on our economy. And when you feel that panic coming on, it's always good to play the what's the worst thing that can happen game. It's the worst game ever. It's not fun at all. What's the worst thing that can happen? You kind of play it all the way down to the very worst thing that can happen. And sometimes when you play that game, it's not as bad as it as it felt it could be, that worst case scenario. And other times it is, but you say it out loud. And then once you say something out loud, you're really able to think about the solutions, think about how you might mitigate risk. Go back to go back to an example. Let's say you have an inventory issue. Inventory is no bueno. No inventory means no revenue, no cash flow. How am I going to pay our payroll? How are we going to stay afloat until we have this figured out? You know, you might start ideating around pre-orders. You might start, you can come up with solutions to the worst case scenario as soon as you sort of, say that thing out loud and play that what's the worst thing that can happen game.
Yeah. And by the way, I don't know if you've seen this, but brands like Apple even, they're trying to get out ahead of it. I think last week, there's a report that they sent a bunch of iPhones, like
Yeah, it was like
5,
600,000.
yeah, from India and China just to get out in front of in front of the tariffs.
Mhm.
And of course, like they're paused now, so it didn't really matter. But you can kind of see how brands are just so dialed in. Like we talked about the concept of agility,
Mhm.
the agility of strategy, of execution, and just trying to understand the impact of what the next steps you could take are, right? It is there are turbulent times, but to your point, it's not the first time they've happened.
Yeah. Yeah, making sure you know, not forgetting the qualitative research too, right? Because some of our data may not be a reflection of those scenarios. So really getting out there, talking with people, you know, understanding what their scenario building is right now. So as we're building scenarios as businesses, individuals are building out scenarios for their personal lives too in smaller ways, right? And really just getting into that customer mindset and understanding, and that helps with the agility on the marketing side. I think too, and this is something that it might be challenging to slow down and execute on this. Um, but thinking about this moment, right, and the context of this current situation, and maybe reframing your brand or reframing your product marketing. Um, it doesn't have to be a pivot, doesn't have to be an overhaul, but just really adjusting it at that brand strategy level
Yeah.
to meet the moment um, is something to consider in a moment in time when there, understandably are a million other tactical things to execute on um, across your marketing initiatives. Maybe you have a brand truth that's about honesty and transparency. What does that mean in this context? Do
Hmm.
you actually, do you as a brand have an opinion about what's happening? Or are you simply transparent about it? Right? Do you want to speak to that opinion or speak to just the situation in your communications, right? Just sort of a moment to reflect on what, based on who your brand is and the values that you've been built your business on in this moment, how do those articulate themselves?
Yeah, 100%. And we've been referring to this period as a period of potential turmoil, uncertainty, but it's also just a period of like huge opportunity because in times like this is when you have the biggest opportunity to showcase how truly congruent your brand is, how congruent your messaging and products are to your values internally in the company
Hmm.
versus those of your consumers.
Yeah, I think it's a great point. I think it's a great point. And as we say at Part and Sum, nothing but opportunity.